If your job at a healthcare facility includes disinfecting against viruses, you know prevention is the best medicine. And maintaining healthy spaces starts with a healthy cleaning routine. Grainger's world-class supply chain helps ensure you have the quality products you need when you need them. From disinfectants and cleaning supplies to personal protective equipment, so you can help deliver a clean bill of health. Call 1-800-GRAINGER, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
On this episode of Booked on Rock, a look at the legendary career of Boz Scaggs, his rise to fame, the stories behind the hits Lowdown and Lido Shuffle, his friendship and working relationship with Steve Miller, why he stepped away from music in the 80s, his return, and more, coming up next.
We're totally booked.
Rock and roll!
Well, I think I'll leave you to your reading.
Little Hand says it's time to rock and roll.
Rock and roller!
We are totally booked.
Welcome back to Booked on Rock. I'm Eric Senich. Jude Warne is the author of the first ever book on Boz Scaggs. It's titled Lowdown, the Music of Boz Scaggs. Jude, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me on. It's good to be here.
Everybody knows about that album, Silk Degrees, from 1976, but that was his 7th studio album, which is amazing to think about. So there was a long career there leading up to that album. You write, quote, "It was through degrees, through layers and steps that Boz became the musician and performer on Silk Degrees, before he recognizably became a hit maker." His roots lie in the blues, some fascinating stuff in this book. Talk about where he grew up and the music that influenced him.
He was very influenced by a lot of the old blues stuff, the classic American blues material. Growing up in Texas and Oklahoma, he really heard different sounds in those genres on the radio growing up. And I feel it really influenced what he wanted to sound like himself as a musician and what he liked to cover. And as you'll read in the book, and if you study his career as a whole, he has done a lot of blues covers, and I'd like to harken it back to those first early influences that he had, that he always kind of gravitated toward that sound and legacy. And even in the last albums he made in the last few years, the Blues Trilogy also kind of pays homage to that sound too.
His real name is William Royce Scaggs. The nickname Boz, that came when he was at a friend's party?
Yeah, it's an interesting story. Just about, this was around the Steve Miller time, I believe, in the St. Mark's school years. And it was kind of like a random association. This also somewhat random student gave to him as kind of a joke. As we know, Boz, the name Boz, doesn't really sound like anything related to his real name, William Royce Scaggs. It was kind of a random thing that stuck, though, I think, with his school mates and his friends and stuff. And he kept it. But I think later on, as I mentioned in the book, he reflects on whether, if he was going to consciously choose this other name, a stage name, he might not have chosen Boz, but that's how it landed. But I think it has a ring to it,
I love it. I love it. You mentioned St. Mark's School. That's in Texas, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Now that is a private prep school. That's the same place he met Steve Miller. And Boz was about 12, Steve about 13. And you write that this meeting would have a profound impact on Boz's musical careers. Talk about that relationship and the impact that Steve Miller had.
Well, I think they recognized each other as somewhat kindred spirits, and in terms of they were both interested in that original American blues sound and a lot of that Texas blues guitar that Steve Miller is so famous for today, or that how he started out anyway. So I feel like they really related on that level. And I think they stood out within the school setting just as these two unique people who were into the same kind of thing, which a lot of musical partnerships seem to start out that same way. But I find it so interesting that they both got so successful and well known. And of course, Boz was in the Steve Miller Band when he was starting out on those first two studio albums, really, that they did. So it was a partnership or friendship that was faded over several years and projects too, not just the school time friendship.
I would say the most recognizable song when Boz was there would have been Living in the USA.
Oh,
Is
yes.
Boz on that one? Yeah, he's on
I
that.
believe so, yeah.
So he was in a few bands with Steve in the early 60s.
Yes, the lineups, as with all these early stories of early incarnations of bands and stuff, kind of switch around, and especially when all of the players were in school, like Summer would sometimes elicit a different lineup of players. But in general, for a while, yes, they were in the Ardells, I think was one of them. Ben Cedron too, who we know was in there as well. So it's an interesting origin story that way.
And then things get really interesting. He leaves school in 1963, travels throughout Europe, and he's he's a street busker. He left the Army Reserves too, right? And then he lived in London. This story behind his first album in 1965 is fascinating. He's in Sweden and he's just offering to help his friend in a band just cover a song, a coaster song. And then the next thing you know, he's being offered an opportunity to record a solo album. Do I have the story right?
Yeah, more or less, exactly. And it kind of just happened that way. It seemed very natural as I understood it. And Boz ended up with this really nice debut solo album, although because it kind of went out of print after that, many people consider like his first studio album, the one in '69, I believe, that he made with Jan Wenner in the US later on with Duane Allman on it. But this was really his first recording experience as a solo person. And it's all covers pretty much, and some early Bob Dylan covers. But you can hear as a listener, I think, him establishing his own sound for himself. And it does sound more like early blues work and folk singing rather than, for example, like the 70s. Silk Degrees sound is very different if you compare the two, but I think you can hear him kind of urging himself forward to establish himself as this artist. And he does have a lot of charm and clear musical talent from the get-go, obviously, with his vocals and guitar playing. But it was very kind of magical the way that happened.
Great vocals, great voice that he has had from the beginning. You mentioned the Dylan cover, Girl from the North Country he covers, which I think he does an excellent job covering it. He said it was difficult for him to cover. What do you think he meant by that? And what do you think of his version of the song?
I love it as well. I think with any artist covering Bob Dylan, who has such a distinct sound, especially vocally, and of course it was his own song, Dylan's own song. So there's such a clear, musical stamp on that sound in listeners' ears, for me anyway. And so for an artist like Boz or anyone to take that on, the choice is like, do you cover it trying to sound more like Dylan, or you do your total own thing? But I think Boz puts his own thing in there, his own sound and interpretation of the meaning behind the song and stuff. So I really like it just for its difference as well from the original.
And the good news is that album is available now. I put together the playlist for this episode, a Boz Scaggs playlist, and that album is available. So people can listen to it. The Dylan cover's on there. And then he joined the Steve Miller Band in 1967, and you write that the two would, quote, prove guitar brothers, at times in sync, at times at odds with one another. He recorded 2 albums with Steve Miller, Children of the Future and Sailor, both released in 1968. But there were problems that surfaced soon after he joined, and at one point Boz and Steve would overplay their guitars on stage on purpose. What was causing the tension between them?
Part of what I loved about this book experience is getting to speak to a few different people who worked with Boz at different eras of his career. So I did get to speak to Jim Peterman, who was an original member of that lineup of the Steve Miller Band, who was there, when Boz and Steve were working together. And he gave me a good sense of how it was to be part of the band at that time. And just from different, articles and interviews I read, I think they were two, Steve and Boz, very strong personalities and clear talents and clear, musical opinions on what they wanted to do and play and stuff. And I think they just eventually got on each other's nerves. But I also, I empathize / sympathize, whatever, with Steve Miller too. I'm such a Steve Miller fan, Steve Miller Band fan. And if you think about like the later records that were in a few years, like Fly Like an Eagle, just the original sound of that he was going for. And he's such a strong musical talent. And of course, there's egos at play, but knowing how talented of a guitarist he was and stuff, I understand how he had this, dominant energy as I see it within the band. And it's his, his name's on the band. It's the Steve Miller Blues Band and then the Steve Miller Band. And Boz has an equal, unique individual musical viewpoint that he wanted to articulate. And I think they're both such solo artists ultimately. I know Steve Miller Band, but, they have clear musical characters. So I'm not surprised that Boz didn't stick around too long within the Steve Miller Band, just considering his own musical ambitions that he had.
Just a matter of time. But what's cool is, at least from what I've seen, and actually there was a recent interview Boz did with Dan Rather. Did you see that?
I did.
He's had nothing but good things to say about Steve Miller and how important he was. So it wasn't like one of those falling outs where over the years there's this bitter war of words. It seems like they're cool now. I don't know if they keep in touch.
So.
Yeah.
Yes, 100%. Just they have a fond memory of getting together and collaborating in those early years and being friends, really, true friends.
Boz went solo, recorded 5 albums between 1969 and 1974 before hitting his commercial peak with 1976's Silk Degrees. He recorded the self-titled album from 69 with a young Duane Allman, which is really interesting. And as a huge Allman Brothers fan, I love listening to that. He contributed the guitar work there. Recorded at Muscle Shoals Studio, 2 albums in 71, Moments, and then Boz Scaggs and Band. 1972, he released My Time. 2 years later, he released Slow Dancer. You go into detail each of these albums in the book, but if you can give a brief overview of what we're hearing from Boz over this period. He starts to explore, like, beyond his blues roots.
Yes, it's interesting to consider that arc. There's a strong blues presence in the first American solo album, anyway, with Duane Allman, the Boz Scaggs records, recorded at Muscle Shoals with Jan Wenner producing and working on that with him and really pushing and celebrating Boz from an early point. So there is that blues sound on that record, and then he kind of goes through getting used to working with a band on the Boz Scaggs and Band record, and that has a lot of horn elements too on certain songs, so you do hear a lot of him like experimenting with different sound potentials, and they're all great in my opinion, just showcasing his amazing voice, which sounds good in anything, of course. And the Moments album is a favorite of mine because I think there's a lot of poetry on there, a lot of musical subtlety. There were reviewers at the time, and I believe I mentioned this in the book too, about comparing it to some of Van Morrison's work of the early 70s. Also, there's this complexity to the sound and the song interpretations, and mostly love songs, romantic songs, which I think are great. And then he does progress forward the next several years through to Slow Dancer, which I love. I think it's a great record. And that album, you really hear more of what became like the Silk Degrees sound, where he has this very strong forefront energy as this front man, even though, he's a solo artist, he is the front man, but you just sense this stronger grasp of his own musicality, I think, and just being this solo artist. And it does get more into the working with Johnny Bristol, who's a Motown producer, I believe, or had worked with those in that area. There's a soul sound that comes into it at that point, the Slow Dancer record. I think I mentioned it in the book, but I remember reading about how Boz, working with Johnny Bristol, he learned more of how to be this kind of strong, kind of edgier frontman, taking control of the song, of the woman, quote unquote, that the singer is addressing narratively in the song, this kind of machismo that comes into it, which I think serves him very well, given his, of course, underneath it, this very strong relation to women. I think in his songs, this kind of romantic appeal that I get. The combination of those elements is nice. And then, of course, as you were leading to, that gets us into the Silk Degrees era, his biggest success.
Lowdown Rock Podcast. We'll be back after this.
We'll be back with the Magic Tones for the Armada Room's 2-hour disco swing party after this short break. Till then, don't you go changing.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Jude Warne is the author of Lowdown, the music of Boz Scaggs. What I love about this is a true artist. On the Dan Rather interview, he's just like, it's just another album for me. I wasn't looking to make hit singles, but these are huge hit singles. The top 40, It's Over, the number 3, Lowdown, number 11, Lido Shuffle, and also a number 42 single, What Can I Say? All 4 of those songs Boz co-wrote with a guy by the name of David Paich of future Toto fame. How did those two meet?
I love that story too, how he met and started working with David Paich. That was through Jeff Porcaro, who is, as we know, this amazing rock drummer on so many famous recordings, and the main drummer of Toto, of course. And he was best friends with David Page. And they were behind the scenes thinking about creating their own band, but were both studio players at the time. And he kind of connected Boz and David. And I think, and I express this in the book, that some of Boz's greatest work is sometimes working with another collaborator, with someone who he can write with and bounce ideas off of. And you can definitely see that on the Silk Degrees record. David Page was this young, up-and-coming composer at the time, too, very young. And he had all these music ideas. And Boz had this clearly established musical persona, too, and musical ideas of his own, of course. And the collaboration really became fruitful, as we know. And the timing was perfect. I think that there was this kind of disco/dance music sound to a lot of the songs, and the timing, the mid 70s, that was perfect. Saturday Night Fever era, it rang true, I think.
And David said Toto was in the works already at this time. Mm-hmm. He was putting that band together at the time.
Yes, that was coming together. All, Steve Lukather and Steve Porcaro, Jeff Porcaro's brother, and David Hungate were these really successful studio players, and they had gravitated toward one another on recordings, and then just being friends of their own too through high school, some of them. So that was on the way to becoming what it was. And of course, as you can read in the book, almost all the Toto players worked with Boz at some point, whether in the studio or touring.
And the biggest hit on the album was one Columbia didn't even think would make a good single, but it was a DJ in Cleveland that helped convince Columbia to release this. I'm referring to Lowdown, right? That's the one.
Yes.
David Page talks about the making of Lido Shuffle and how it was inspired by a Paul McCartney song.
Yes, that was the Venus and Mars album, I believe. And Magneto, Titanium Man, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. But yes, they were always kind of influenced a lot, like all great artists, by the Beatles, and the Wings era at that time too. The music that Paul and the band was putting out, I think, had a bit of that dance sound in there anyway, or it was starting to come out more. So yes, he did connect it to that.
And it's just a fictional dance that he just made up the name Lido Shuffle.
Yeah, I think it works well, and while the lyrics are great, and from what I understand, Boz is such a great lyricist, just with the kind of the street lingo narratively he's able to inject into songs, and then the romantic knowledge that comes in there too. But I think it's the beat and the sound and the drum beat of that song, for me, that really, it has that hook,
It's just amazing. Those two songs, Lido Shuffle and Lowdown, to this day, they're timeless songs, and they're going to be played for the rest of time. You can listen, you can hear them on the radio and I maybe commercials or movies, whatever, but it's always out there. And as soon as you hear the first 3 to 5 seconds, everybody recognizes it. They may not know it's him. They may not know the name of the song or whatever, but it's just instantly recognizable. And that says a lot about his ability to write a great song.
I think so too. It has that timeless quality, and there's some modernity in there too that rang true at the time. And I think that same essence still, like you're saying, holds up today. It has a new, fresh sound whenever I hear it. I think.
The last track on Silk Degrees is "We're All Alone." Not a hit for Boz, but it was for Frankie Valli in 1976, and the next year for Rita Coolidge. On Boz's version, we have this beautiful orchestra. This is thanks to David Page's very famous and talented father, Marty Page. Now, David talks about his dad's contributions in the book. He had a great story about the string and horn arrangements in Lowdown. This is about him taking an eraser to David's original compositions.
Yes, I'm fascinated by that idea in general in music. I think David Page was this young, excited, talented composer who felt he could do anything, and he could, but perhaps with some of the orchestrations and writing out the different layouts of different instruments parts on that track could have gotten a bit exuberant, and I think it would have sounded beautiful anyway, but his dad, Marty, being more experienced and having more of a, perhaps at that time, subtle or tuned in ear, David describes it in the book as taking an eraser and just getting rid of a lot of these unnecessary notes. And I think in that simplicity or in that sleekness, the elegance comes out of that as a listener. And I think that's such a trademark element of the Silk Degrees album, that elegance. It's there on the cover. There's this sleek, high life kind of feeling that I get. And I think a lot of listeners get that's very appealing. It's like watching a really beautiful romantic film or something. But yes, Marty Page was so interesting. He has such a legacy working with, I believe, on the Glenn Campbell show and working with
everybody,
El Torme and everyone else.
I think Sinatra. I was looking at
I believe so.
His bio. What's really cool with Toto, you have the current singer of Toto is John Williams' son, and John Williams of Star Wars, Jaws composer,
Yes.
you know? And then you have David Paich and his dad, not too shabby. Yeah, I mean, there's some serious musical talent there. But yeah, David, he welcomed his dad's contributions. I mean, he was just going to listen to whatever he said and just soak it all up.
Yes, I think a lot of the Toto members had that experience, as you're saying, with their parents, and even the Jeff and Steve's father, Joe Porcaro, was this known studio drummer, and they were good about going to him for advice and guidance and stuff. And
I didn't know that. Okay, there's a third. Yes.
Yeah, the child to parent, not rebelling necessarily, but working together well on the same kind of musical mission, I guess.
Yeah. So Boz says he could have repeated the formula of Silk Degrees, but he did not want to do that. Again, he's just true artist. How does he respond to the success of Silk Degrees, and where does he decide to go sonically on 1977's Down, Two, Then Left?
Well, Down, Two, Then Left is actually my favorite Boz record, as
Really?
much as I love Silk Degrees. There's something about Down, Two, Then Left that has the sound that Boz and his collaborators were able to reach on Silk Degrees, that modern mid-70s dance kind of sound. But he takes it a bit further on Down, Two, Then Left, I think. And there's a bit of a even more slakeness, if that's possible, to that record. So I have such a fondness for that record. But yes, I mean, he didn't want to repeat the exact same formula. He chose not to work with David Paich again for that record, but he did work with some of the same studio players. And Steve Lukather, I believe A Clue is on that album, and that was one of Steve's breakout solos that got him a lot of notoriety or attention in the studio scene at the time. And it's one of my favorite guitar solos of all time. I just think it's perfect. So it's exciting for that as well. But I love that album.
Breakdown, Dead Ahead, I love.
Yes, that's on Middleman, I think. Which is
that on Middleman? Okay, that's on 1980s Middleman.
Yeah, and I consider those albums like a trilogy, kind of. There's a similar sound to them all, and a lot of the same players are on all the records, and I love them.
Yeah, Breakdown, Dead Ahead, and JoJo. Those are the two singles off of Middleman,
Yes.
1980. What happens after now is, again, another interesting part of Boz's story. He intended to follow up 1980s Middleman with another album fairly soon, take a short break. But that short break turns into an 8-year break. What led to his extended hiatus?
I think, like you're alluding to, he didn't intend for it to be several years. He did need a break at the time. He kind of likens it to a fast-moving train, just being on this success machine, and all of the other elements of life that are keeping it afloat, the record company, and then keeping a tour going, and just this kind of energy behind it. Well-meaning, I believe, and the fans wanted it and stuff, but it can wear an artist out. So at an interesting point, Boz chose to take a break. I think from what I learned writing this and just doing deep listens to all of his albums and studying his persona a bit from my angle, he seems like such an authentic person and artist to me, that following his own impetus and trajectory, and was very successful and good at staying true to himself. And there are many artists who understandably get caught up in that star-making machine, and it's appealing, of course, when the success is already there, but Boz has this kind of to thine own self be true element, and I think he felt at the time like he just needed to tune into himself, as we're saying. But
and then he came back. Other Roads was 1988.
Yes.
Okay. Columbia was worried that too much time had passed.
Yeah, I think, and if you look at the years in music at that time from 80 to 88, a lot had happened. Drum machines had taken over even more, and I think MTV, right? Yeah, that was a big change, of course. And then if you look at like the early 90s that came after, and that kind of grunge sound that was building up, and then the MTV specials that were coming out, the unplugged sound, which I like too. That's later, of course, but yes, music was really changing, and Boz had to kind of deal with that and cope with that, and not just receiving this big A+ yes, go ahead from the record company at first, having to kind of compromise more than he had in the past when he had more clout, just commercially speaking at the early 80s.
But he did prove he could still create some hits, or at least one lead single, Heart of Mine, was top 40.
Isn't that a beautiful song? I love
song.
That record.
Yeah. Then he followed with 94's Some Change, 1996 Fade into Light, 1997 Come On Home, very active into the 2000s. 01's Dig, 03's But Beautiful, 08's Speak Low, and in 2010 he was part of a supergroup, which I want to ask you about. What was the Dukes of September?
That was that's one of my favorite parts of Boz's story, just because I'm a Steely Dan fan as well. So that was when he worked more intensely with Donald Fagen, the lead singer of Steely Dan, and Michael McDonald of the Doobie Brothers. partially. So that was a successful supergroup, as you say. And it started out with working with, I believe it was Donald Fagen's wife would put together these musical sets in New York and have different artists kind of come in and contribute. And then it turned into bigger shows. And then they released a live album. And then eventually went on tour a bit later. I guess that was 2010, it was in the 2000s.
There are clips on YouTube.
Yeah, and there's a concert film also. That's right, and the set list on that is great. They each, McDonald, Scaggs, and Fagen all perform their own hits, and then some covers that they all like. But there's a seamless quality to the sound, I think, in the concert film I'm thinking of anyway. So I think it was well matched.
Would have been cool, a studio album.
Yes.
Would have come out of it.
Material, that would have been great.
Oh yeah, that would have been great. 2018's Out of the Blues. You say that that's the most bluesy in his blues trilogy of albums, which began with 2013's Memphis, followed by 2015's A Fool to Care. And as you say, he's had more than his share of the blues, but he's resilient, and his deep allegiance to music and creating it enabled him to keep going forward. He's now 80 years old, but he's still going. In fact, I think I looked on his website. He's got some shows booked, I believe. So he's still, he's still going. And I'm seeing that there's a North American tour coming in the fall of 2025. Do you see Boz giving his fans another album in the near future? What do you think? What do you hope for from him?
I hope so. I mean, it's hard to say, ahead of time, but I think if alone due to the success of that recent trilogy, the blues covers albums, it just really showcases Scaggs' musicality, especially the last one. I think the cover of Neil Young's On the Beach is on that one. And that's just such a beautiful version of that song. And it showcases Scaggs' talent as a vocal interpreter. That was also showcased well, I thought, on the he did 2 standards covers albums that you just mentioned a bit earlier in the 2000s, but that also showcases just his ability to access different musical genres and his sensitivity to other people's material as well as his own. So I'm hoping there's more.
He seems to be in a good place. It seems as if ever since he came back in the late 80s, he's just doing what he enjoys, being an artist. That doesn't have to worry about all that pop star fame and all that stuff. I don't think he ever wanted it. Lowdown, the music of Boz Scaggs, is out April 8th. You can find it wherever books are sold. Where can people find you online, Jude?
I have my website, which is my name, www.judewarne.com, and you can purchase the book at any bookstore, Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, and the publisher Chicago Review Press. Their website also keeps it together.
Jude Warne, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great.
That's it. It's in the books.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.